A man who has lived in the United States for 45 years is being floated. Again, as part of the answer to Iran's future, that is where this story begins. Not because dynasties are dramatic, not because nostalgia is interesting, because the moment a war begins leaning on an exile fantasy to explain what comes after regime change, the war has already admitted its deepest weakness. It does not have a real post-war design, and once a war loses the future, the present starts unraveling too. That is the real danger here, because the real story is not whether the United States can keep bombing Iran. The real story is that Washington still cannot describe the political world it expects to exist after all. That bombing is over. And if you cannot describe the post-war order, then you do not have a serious war strategy. You have a sequence of strikes attached to a hope. That is why the entire conflict keeps collapsing back onto the same hidden center, regime change. Every official sentence keeps trying to dance around it. Every actual logic inside the war keeps returning to it. Destroy the missiles. If the regime survives, the missiles come back, destroy the drones. If the regime survives, the drones come back, destroy the enrichment path. If the regime survives, the enrichment path comes back, break the connection to Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. If the regime survives, those relationships come back too. That is why regime change is not one possible objective among many. It is the buried requirement underneath almost all the others. And the moment you say that plainly, the whole structure starts to crack, because then you have to answer two questions. No one in Washington has answered in any serious way. Can you get regime change? And what replaces it if you do? Start with the first one. Can the United States and Israel break the Iranian regime from the air without boots on the ground, in a way that produces durable political collapse rather than simply staggering destruction? There is no strong reason to think so. Air power can pulverize targets, it can kill commanders, it can turn infrastructure into rubble. What it cannot reliably do is build a replacement state in the space left behind. In fact, when a regime believes it is facing extinction, the pressure often works in the opposite direction. It hardens the state, it narrows the internal circle. It turns survival into the one unquestionable organizing principle. That is not victory, that is entrenchment under fire. Now take the second question. Suppose somehow the regime does break. Then who takes over? Who governs the ministries, the cities, the security services, the military remnants, the ideological apparatus, the patronage networks, the revenge cycles, the wounded political class, the armed factions, the public panic? Where is the internal pro-American structure prepared to rule Iran in a way that aligns with the goals Washington claims to want? There is no serious answer. And that is why the conversation keeps drifting toward figures whose very appearance in the discussion is proof of strategic emptiness. The moment people begin talking seriously about the Shah's son, a man who has lived in America for 45 years, they are not revealing confidence. They are revealing the absence of a real design. A post-war order is not a famous surname. It is not a memory. It is not a family tree. It is an internal governing architecture with legitimacy, coercive depth, institutional capacity, and some believable relationship to the society it is supposed to govern. That does not exist here, and that is why the war already looks hollow at the center. Now, look at the rhetoric. One day, the war is about enrichment. The next day, it is about missiles. Then it is about deterrence. Then it is about Israel. Then it sounds like regime change. Then it is not regime change again. Then the Iranian people are invited into the streets. That is not strategic flexibility. That is a government trying out one explanation after another, because none of them can bear the real weight of the war, honestly. And that is why one line from the source remains the most devastating in the whole document. The United States cannot win this war in any meaningful way. Iran only has to survive. That sentence is the key to everything, because it tells you that the two sides are not actually fighting on symmetrical terms. Washington needs transformation. Tehran needs continuity. Washington needs a political destination. It still cannot define. Tehran needs to avoid political death. One side needs to build a new world. The other only needs to outlast the fantasy. That is not a balanced contest. That is a contest rigged in favor of the side with the simpler objective. And this is where the military picture matters, Too much discussion still treats Iran as if it is already functionally gone. That is wrong. Iran is damaged, Iran is degraded, but degraded is not gone. A state does not need full strength to make a war strategically punishing. It needs enough residual capacity to deny the stronger side a clean finish. Iran still has that. Enough missiles, enough drones, enough launchers, enough hardened sites, enough regional pressure points, enough will, enough geography, enough to keep making the stronger side spend. That is the point Washington still refuses to face. It can keep destroying things, but destruction is not the same thing as closing the war. On terms it can honestly call victory. And every day, the war continues without a believable political ending. Iran's threshold for success gets easier to meet while America's gets harder. Now add the inventory problem. This matters more than rhetoric. The United States does not have unlimited weapons. We already learned from Ukraine that stockpiles are finite. Production takes time, and long wars expose industrial weaknesses the political class would rather not discuss. Now place a consuming war in the Middle East on top of those existing pressures, while still claiming that China in East Asia remains the long-term pacing challenge. That is not strategic freedom. That is strategic compression. And a compressed power is easier to bleed than it likes to imagine. Iran does not have to beat the United States militarily. It only has to survive while Washington keeps burning munitions, time, strategic bandwidth, and credibility on a war it still cannot politically define. That is enough. That is why I think the war is unwinnable in the only sense that matters. Not because America lacks destructive capacity. It does not. Not because Iran is stronger militarily. It is not. But because America still has no plausible path from military destruction to a stable political reality that serves its declared goals. That is the trap. Now, take the darkest possibility. What if Tehran decides this is no longer about bargaining, but about extinction? What if it concludes the war is not meant to pressure the regime, but to end it? Then the entire logic changes. A state trying to preserve room for negotiation behaves one way. A state convinced it is going down behaves another way entirely. Then the question becomes not how do we survive intact, but how much damage can we still spread before the end? That means Gulf energy. That means ports. That means desalination. That means shipping. That means Hormuz becoming a wound instead of a bargaining chip. This is where the war stops being a campaign and starts approaching ruin logic. And that is why so much of Washington's public language sounds bizarre. This is not really a war. We are finishing it. We are setting the terms. Boots on the ground are not ruled out. Those are not the words of a system with a clean strategy. Those are the words of a political machine trying to keep moving while the strategic center remains empty. And that is the deepest problem. Not that America is weak, that it is strong without a believable future attached to its strength. That is how powerful states get lost. Not when they run out of force, when force outruns design. That is exactly what is happening here. So how does this end? Maybe there is still an off-ramp. Maybe both sides decide the costs are too high. Maybe the White House eventually chooses to declare enough and step back. But even that becomes harder with every strike, every promise, every widened expectation, every deeper tie to Israel's logic of escalation, and every extra day in which the political destination remains undefined. That is why I think the real shape of the war is already visible. A stronger state with bombs, but no believable ending. A weaker state with damage, but a simpler win condition. A campaign whose real center is regime change, a regime change project with no credible successor. A post-war fantasy so thin that it has to borrow legitimacy from an exile figure whose very availability proves how little has actually been built inside the country. That is not a stable path to victory. That is a warning if you want the whole thing compressed into one hard line. It is this. When your future leader lives in exile, your war plan is already empty.